Hello again and welcome to another question and answer session. I'm David Willey, I'm the curator, so I will be trying to answer some of the questions you've sent in. And the first question is from Sir Calculus. Why is it that the British tanks rarely had a semi-auto pre-selector gearbox like the Daimler armoured cars, Saladin Saracen, to allow for vehicles top speed in reverse? I would think it would give a fantastic one-up against a tank without that ability. Well, I'm not the person really to answer this, to be honest. I'm not the engineer. I do know a little bit about Wilson pre-selector gears, and basically the idea is, if those of you who are not an engineer as well like me, the general gist is what you do with a pre-selector gearbox is, as it says, you pre-select the gear you want to go into, and instead of depressing the clutch and then changing that gear, you've pre-selected it. What's the equivalent of the clutch pedal, you actually just stamp down on and you go straight into that gear. And then you can pre-select down again if you're changing down or going up, and you stamp on the clutch and it goes straight in it. Now, pros and cons, and again, I'm not the engineer to take you through all those different gearing systems, but for the British, Daimler introduced it. Walter Wilson, the famous First World War tank guy, he's a designer of it. Daimler introduced it in some of their sports cars, etc., in the 30s, and family cars. It's put on the Daimler Dingo, it's put on the Daimler armoured car, and then those series of British armoured cars, so it goes on with Saladin, Saracen, even Fox as well, a post-war period. What you don't see a Wilson pre-selector box on is something big and heavy in terms of major tanks. There are other types of pre-selector systems. The Wilson one tends to be a fluid flywheel. Other types actually have very different ways of doing it. So the Tiger, for example, in Germany, that has a pre-selector system. You select the gear first and then it will go into that gear once you've depressed your relevant pedal. So there's different ways of doing that. And that's a long-winded way to really say, actually, I don't really know the answer to that. Why don't we actually use pre-selectors on certain other vehicles? What advantages do that really give? So one of you out there who's an engineer really needs to answer that as a question. So I will move swiftly on to something a little bit more, hopefully I can answer. Julian Corbett. Are you hoping eventually to get all the tanks that the museum owns into at least fully restored and displayable, or better still in full running order, or is that an unrealistic goal? Good question. At the back of our minds, if you're honest, most museums we are collecting, or we have collected, at an unsustainable rate. In other words, there's never enough conservation resources, there's never enough space, certainly with bigger items, never enough cabinets to display material, there's never enough hours in the day. And yet museums carry on collecting, and that's because they've got that terrible thought at the back of the mind, if we don't collect now, we may never have that opportunity again. And the other issue is, of course, with museums as well, is that idea about how encyclopedic should you be and what's significant or important. Now, sometimes because a museum collects something, it becomes important. So think of fine art. If an artist gets into the Tate Gallery, then somehow they're sort of made. Whereas in other areas, there's that feeling that even though it's not particularly attractive or well-liked now, if you collect something now, you've got that chance of getting ahead of the game. So from the point of view of, we've got a range of things here. We know out there, only from these questions and other things like that, we know where people's real major interest is, but the truth is we want to cover the subject. And there's areas of that subject, because of anniversaries or because of interest, because of online gaming, because of all sorts of things, that will come to the floor at a later date, which is why we feel like we can't risk not collecting things. At the same time, I've mentioned in previous ones, we also prune the collection. So if you get a better example, or actually we collect a whole vehicle, but really it's that bit of a vehicle's important, maybe we could take that bit off and save that, and then not have to put together enough space to hold the entire item. But the idea behind us collecting in the first place is a representative collection. We have a priority, it's British armour first, what our allies, what we fought against. And we try to make that, the aspiration is pretty comprehensive. So that's good in the first thing. Can we make all those vehicles run? I would say there's probably a century of conservation/restoration work to do here already with the current resources. So we're being unrealistic if we say we're going to try and get everything to run. However much the interest comes in, the money comes in, even then I think it's still kind of over-egging it. What should we run? Now here we've got a belief that certain types of vehicles running helps with the interpretation and the understanding of the audience. Static tanks around me is one thing. There's a scale to having all these vehicles which does come across, the size of them. Start the engine, drive it around in our arena, suddenly another layer comes to that. Now we don't do everything, we don't fire the guns, which is obviously a key component of that vehicle. So the idea, do we want it all to work, are we going to fire the guns and everything? No, I don't think we will. Too big a risks. What if there's a major failure? What are we actually firing that gun for in terms of the understanding? So our aspirations there are slightly schizophrenic over time. There's certain vehicles we've got going. We did it because we wanted to put ourselves on the map. I've mentioned before Tiger 131's classic example of that, where the restoration back to running order of that vehicle at the time it was done with the help we got, starting at the end of the 1990s, was very much to say, look, here is a very important, rare running German vehicle that helps focus attention and also builds momentum behind us to allow us to perhaps continue restoring in other areas. So what we restore and why, to get a sort of representative collection of vehicles we can run. What can we sustainably run is going to be part of the problem. Some vehicles, there are still spares out there, other areas of vehicles as well. You can imagine it's going to be every time, if anything goes wrong, it's going to be a one-off bespoke problem of having to fix because spare parts aren't necessarily around. So there's a host of issues there. Aspirationally, I think, wouldn't it be lovely to say we could restore everything to running order? Practically, I very much doubt that. And certainly in terms of conservation, for example, we have put to bed our First World War fleet. We are not going to run those anymore. And that is because we know the conservation issues there, too much risk, metal fatigue. What if we do major damage there? Let's try and keep the originality we do have. Hence, we have a replica A7V, a replica Mark IV we can run that kind of fills that gap in the collection. Maybe again in the future, other new interventions, new conservation techniques, new things may come along that means we don't have to damage or substantially alter those earlier vehicles, which might mean other things that we're saying now we don't think we're going to run. Maybe that may be possible again in the future. But quite a number of different things. And of course, there's the other key element of all of this, resource. Putting a tank back together in working order, huge amount of time, huge amount of money, a lot of energy and effort. And if you're not careful, it can run perhaps a few times that year. And then you're going to have to do it again the following year, a few years later, etc. So there's a lot of pieces come together before that decision can really be made. And if I'm honest as well, logically, not always, we don't always make those decisions in what you would call like a perfect matrix of ticking boxes, weighing up risks, cost benefit analysis, etc. Sometimes opportunities arrive, we'll do it. Other times it might well be something like an anniversary coming up, or let's do this one because we haven't run it for a while. So, you know, interesting set of issues. Right, next one, let's have a look. Robert Henry Ilston. I know there are various speciality tanks, Hobart's Funny, were issued out on an as-needed basis and then returned to the parent regiment. But how about modification like the hedge cutter on the Shermans in the Bocage or extra armour plates, etc.? Were those modifications done in the field by the various crews, or were orders sent down to make the modifications? The answer to that one is interestingly, really in a funny sort of way, a bit of both. Famously in Normandy, so we're talking about here, he'd mentioned the Shermans in the Bocage, the Cullen hedgerow design, Sergeant Cullen, he gets an idea from one of his mates. Cullen very honestly tries to downplay his role in it, but he's the one who gets associated with it. Why do we put prongs, as it were, cutters, on the front of a Sherman, weld them up? They use some of the beach defences, German beach defences, hedgehogs first of all, cut those, sharpen the edges, weld them on the front, and that can cut through one of these high banked hedges in the Bocage and stop the tank having to ride up over the top, exposing its weaker underbelly and being very vulnerable to German armour. Now, those field innovations that were done in the field, Bradley, the American general, comes and has a look and says, great idea, we're going to want that for Operation Cobra. He actually has extra welding gear sent out to Normandy. So sort of temporary workshops are set up to help cut this and fix to quite a number of US Sherman, Stuarts, other armoured vehicles as well. but he also has sets made up back in the UK. And so, again, it's part of this, sometimes it's the idea appears in the front line and that filters back or is taken back and added on. Another area is mentioning here about armour. Now, you'll see on lots of pictures, crews themselves making their own add-on armour by such things as sometimes sandbags, sometimes draping extra track links over the front of the vehicles, etc. Now, for the British, Monty was aware of this. He knew that actually in tests, a lot of that add-on armour made no fundamental difference to the tank, but it made the crews feel better by doing it. So he said, let the lads do it then. Patton, on the other hand, he realised that by adding all these sandbags, you were taking away all this extra armour weight, you were taking away one of the advantages he saw in having a tank like the Sherman, which was its mobility and speed. And therefore he said, no, you shouldn't do that. And there is actually a photograph somewhere of a rather wincing looking American officer walking away, having a complete bollocking by Patton for putting these sandbags all over the front of his vehicle, and therefore potentially losing part of its effectiveness, its mobility. So how these things were dealt with, most applique armour was actually done back in the factories or in major units. Sometimes you'll see bits and pieces that are kind of like field mod ones. So it's a bit of mix and match across the spectrum, how some of those things were done. So I think that kind of answers that one as best I can, I think, on that particular question. Interceptor 56.5. One of the things, the question is basically, I won't go through the whole thing, but it's basically, the question is, how is it that public opinion is influencing through the media what happens in terms of military equipment today? So the idea, you know, there's a campaign in the press, this is rubbish, our boys are risky, or we should buy this instead of that one for sometimes nationalistic reasons, etc. And really the question is what is your thoughts on how public opinion has become more involved over a weapons program, as a weapons program's procedure, or is this a case of a loud booming voice that doesn't really affect the weapons development? And if it is, should it be? I think, in a way, this is one of those questions where we think it's something contemporary, but actually my gut feeling is it's always been there. The idea that there has been a public voice in procurement and equipment. And when you think about it, that voice is, in democracies, it's there anyway by votes. So in other words, you know, if you're the political party that says, I'm going to put loads of more money into defence, in many ways, straight away, that's the start of this process about the public there. Now, in a democracy, you can argue very carefully and very clearly that this is a good thing, because what the military has, what it buys, what we think that military is for, is part of that national debate. Obviously, you could argue that therefore in certain circumstances your hands tied behind your back when you're fighting a totalitarian regime or a regime that doesn't want to actually discuss anything about military purchases or defence budgets in the round. So, you know, how does that weigh up? If you're at the wrong end of it, in the sense fighting a totalitarian regime that's not bothered about any of the issues or ethics to do with purchasing or creation of weapon systems, you may feel you're coming off worse. In the longer run, history seems to tell us that those totalitarian regimes are going to come a cropper in the end, or it'll fail, and democracies, he says, fingers crossed, seem to have that better edge of reinventing themselves. So what does that answer the question? Not really. I just think going back to, in this age of fake news and everything else, actually fake news has always been around. We mentioned before about things like propaganda. The idea that the public, it's always been, again, going back, nationalistic press saying about what we should buy and what we shouldn't buy. We need, you know, what are those core industries you want your own country to maintain? What are the things that actually in the modern world actually as, you know, joint purchases, the fact we seem to use an awful lot of other people's equipment nowadays rather than it has to be built in their own country. France, one of those countries going through that debate, desperately trying to historically hang on to its own weapons and defence industry. In a modern world, is that actually sustainable? when the orders for some of this material, it will be so small and that wider market might not want to buy into your smaller product, in other words, with all the support packages and everything around it. Those things are bound to go on. But one thing I would say as well, there are areas of it, whatever we think, is actually then kept quiet. So things are kept quiet for very good reasons sometimes, because there's points in a conversation or a debate or a process to actually get that defence equipment where it's probably best not to have overall public scrutiny until there is a positive outcome. Or the other thing about the positive or scrutiny is one thing, but don't let that positive scrutiny give the game away in certain areas. So an example might be in Britain, we still have secret armour on Challenger tanks. We don't want people to absolutely know the full specification of what's in there for very good reasons. Now you could argue, oh, let's have a public debate about that. Again, I think most people in the end would say, if that's my boy in that tank, I would not want the enemy to know exactly how to defeat it. So again, so there'll be areas that way. But it's something that, as I say, I just think it's been there all along. Perhaps because of the modern media age, it's more prevalent to see that. And the idea that how that influencing is going on, it does go on. But don't forget that public debate influence, just think of it the other way around. It's been there all along in terms of defence lobbying, industrial concerns saying this is a product you're going to need, you know, because I want to make the money from it. So just because now it's in the public domain, before it was perhaps in a closed shop domain, but much more to do with about industries and certain vested interests. Right, next picture. Question. Andrew, I'm going to have a slurp of coffee. You can relax a second while I have my slurp of coffee. Andrew Weeby, I believe. I'm sorry if I said your name wrong. Is it true that the front of a Tiger II was so thick it has never been penetrated by an Allied tank round? I've had this question kind of before, where a guy got very irate and he kept showing us that pictures of the Tiger II, King Tiger in the Ardennes at Le Glaise and saying, look, it's penetrated. My source on this is Tom Yentz. He's the one who actually made that statement in the first place, never a Tiger II. There's no imagery, there's no obvious sort of record of one being penetrated. And the word penetration, that means in this context, or as I think as Tom was trying to explain it as well, which is complete penetration, in other words, all the way through. So that Tiger in Le Glaise has got a massive great gouge in, but actually if you're inside there's no sense of daylight or split or anything actually coming all the way through. So again, if you go back to that, prove me wrong, I might be, but I don't think out there's any actual evidence of a frontal penetration. Now, weapon systems could penetrate the front of a Tiger, it just doesn't seem to have happened in terms of actual conflict in the Second World War. Sphinx. Was there ever an Allied or Russian version of heavy rocket artillery like the German Sturm Tiger, or was that vehicle a breed all of its own? Besides being slow, was there any practicality to such a weapon at all? Well, the Sturm Tiger from the German point of view is really a demolition weapon, and the idea there, it was for sieges, and again after they'd had some of the sieges when they're going into Russia of fortified towns, defences, Crimea, things like that. That's where that weapon system, the idea of having a massive demolition capability that was mobile, was considered worthwhile, and hence they get this rocket gun that is being used on the Sturm Tiger. In a way, we had the same issues in the Western Allies. So the British, with its 79th Armoured Division, specialised armour, we use the petard mortar. It's a smaller calibre, and it actually, but it's again, it's not the standard type of gun. It's a mortar gun fitted onto a with a spigot mortar that basically fires a charge off at the end of the round of the mortar round that then is fired out a couple hundred yards, whopping great dustbin full of explosive on the end, huge blast effect for knocking down walls, pillboxes, blasting its way forward. So in a sense, yes, the Western Allies saw the the need for certain types of weapons like that, we didn't quite use a rocket gun in the same ways as the Germans did. But again, weirdly, we did use rockets. We used Typhoon rockets put on the sides of not just tanks, and a range of tanks had them fitted with rails on the side, but they even things like some armoured cars were put on the side. And the idea there was it was just a way of getting yet another bit more firepower for the right moment, and quite dramatic looking firepower with a 6-inch rocket fired off the side of the vehicle. Not particularly accurate, but again for blast effect, and the idea that if you're driving around and you've got that extra oomph with you, might well, certainly from late 44 into 45, have a psychological impact on the enemy as well, which again you can't help but feel if you're at the receiving end of a Sturm Tiger round. Probably is going to be another one of those sorts of things where if you've survived, it's probably going to sort of change your fighting spirit for the rest of the day. Right, so that's demolition ones. I'm going to move on. MJ Painter, you contributed to the Age of Tanks documentary series currently showing on Netflix. I personally found it a little strange with the choice of topics covered, especially how quickly they skimmed over World War II. I imagine you wouldn't want to comment too critically on the series, but what do you think they missed or overrepresented? I haven't seen the series, if I'm honest with you. I know I was in it. I was given basically a set of questions, whipped out to the studio in Paris. I was a number of people that they'd interview over the course of the programme, veterans and all sorts of other people as well. I haven't seen the series, so I can't actually comment on how well balanced it might have been. It was an Anglo-French production in the first place. That might give you some indication perhaps why they didn't heavily dwell on World War II. But at the same time, like so many of these programmes and things, when you're interviewed for it, you don't quite often get to see what the whole entity is, how you're going to be cut down. You know, most companies are pretty good, they're fairly ethical, they won't completely just take your one line of positivity after 90% negativity about something or other, you know, and just try and use that to their own advantage. But at the same time, you don't see the full scripts, everything. You know, they did come here, the producers, they did do some filming at the museum. We did make suggestions to them of sources and other things and where they might go for certain issues. But the honest truth is once a film is made or filming is done here with perhaps myself, David Fletcher, somebody else here at the museum, how that's going to be used is way beyond our control. And I haven't got Netflix, so I've never seen that series. So I saw a couple of little excerpts they showed us, but I haven't seen anything, so I can't really comment. But yet again, generally from the Tank Museum point of view, whether we absolutely agree with it or not, you can't help but feel it does us all good in terms of it brings our subject to the fore again. Right, Alan Titchcombe. Hello, David. I wonder if you could say a few words about the interior finishes of British and American tanks in World War II. Was it white or base metal, unpainted? Well, my gut thing was actually we used in Britain, it used to be white. Well, actually, really early on, actually, if you look at the First World War tanks, they were kind of white off-white sometimes. We had white, then we went to a silver. That was replaced by white, and then halfway through World War II, or 43 onwards, there were some paint issues going on, shortages, and that's where the silvery colour comes back in. And if you look at some late Comets, etc., they're starting to go out. Sometimes it's called aluminium paint, sometimes it's silver, but it is a paint, it's not actually the metal surface inside. Now the issue there being, why they want white, they sometimes use a colour called eau de Nil, water of the Nile, a slight greeny white, off-white colour. The whole point being is that inside the tank, because it's dark, you need as much light as you possibly can, even though there might be sometimes festoon lights up inside. And that idea that you want it light, what you don't want, of course, is when you open up the tank, so the interior of hatches, doors, etc., always painted the external colour. And there were one or two examples given, I believe, of where people actually painted, for example, around the driver's areas, they sometimes painted it dark again so that the light from the outside was always going to be more prominent, because that's where obviously things were very important. But if you're in the turret, you know, looking for a shell or something on the wall or plugging something in, you need as much reflected light, hence a lighter colour inside. But that idea, the British vehicles, anyway, at some point we must do a proper one with some of the paint code numbers. So white or off-white tends to be the case. And then from late war on, and certainly into the 50s until quite a bit later, they go back to that silverish finish. And nowadays modern tanks are back to white or an off-white colour when you can see any of the interior, because so much of them are covered now with kit. Could we get any, this is from TN Sheep, could we get a video on David Fletcher and his history with the museum and in academia? Good idea. We're actually thinking at some point maybe we should have an evening with David Fletcher, a question and answer session, that sort of thing, and a glass of something. That would probably go down quite well. We'll ask David that and see what we can do for you. James Burrett, is it possible to explain how convoluted financing the operations of the Tank Museum can be? Don't get me going. As an American, sometimes the finer point of supporting such overseas charitable organisations like the museum are either misunderstood or not understood at all. Our issue here, really, from our point of view, is in Britain, there are a lot of museums. Their funding structures and how they work is very different areas, but the Ministry of Defence, so the British government, the army side of museums, traditionally there was a museum for each regiment in the army. Now the British Army obviously over time expanded massively in certain wars, contracted again, and what has happened is there is a programme ongoing where a lot of those smaller regimental museums, where the regiment, the serving regiment, has amalgamated, in other words, 2 or 3 regiments come together to form a new body. They're looking to try and do that with the museums because we've got too many. They're unsustainable. We can't really keep them all going. Now, we've also got core level museums in the UK, so Royal Engineers, Royal Artillery, things like that. Now, they are also, we're the Royal Armoured Corps Museum, as well as a regimental museum for the Royal Tank Regiment. We as a body, they are supported by the Army through their heritage branch. Many of these museums will have some of their costs paid for, in other words, a certain number of staff, but not necessarily all of their costs. And certainly for the Tank Museum, the size of establishment we have a few posts paid for by the government. We have, or the Army, we have the ground here at Bovington given to us in essence for free. If we put up a new building, we have to pay for it. Hopefully the MOD will then look after it once we've established it. In other words, they'll pay for the maintenance and the power supplies. So a bit complex, and every lease a museum has with the Army in different areas is quite often slightly different. So they're not all a mirror image and not all the same. And so on the other side of it, so there's a basic structure there, very, very underfunded basic structure in place. Those organisations, though, have, such as ourselves, have the opportunity to go out and get more funding from other bodies that are set up, sometimes by government, sometimes by charity, where money is gifted to help museums run. So we go here at the Tank Museum to the Heritage Lottery Fund, which is a fund from people who gamble and buy a lottery ticket. We've done very well for fairly major capital projects, building new buildings. They like us because of our audience. We get a lot of people come here who, again, don't normally go to museums, etc., so they can be introduced to the subjects, or that museums are quite entertaining places. So we get money from the lottery, we get money from something called the Arts Council. That's been funding some of the things like our Matilda Diaries, some of the films we're making. We get money from other grant-giving bodies. We get a little bit of money from some of the regimental and veterans associations type things who help support that way. And we're always on the lookout, which is why we're doing things like Patreon. What we're trying to do all the time is whatever activities we do here, we've got to find the money to do those activities. It is not like somebody leans over and just sort of constantly says, oh yes, you're a bit short this year, here you go, chum. So that sense of having to find the money to be able to do the things we're doing, which, back to an earlier question, all these tanks, just think of the actual man hours and costs. We use volunteers, but that's not going to do everything. So we still need paid posts and paid engineers, parts, all the different sorts of things to keep something going. So that's how we work here. We do get military support in some areas, but because of the downsizing of the military, that means it's, you know, the serving soldiers are busy boys. You're not going to suddenly find 50 soldiers sent down here to help tidy the place up or sweep the floor or paint tanks. That just doesn't happen anymore. So that sense of where does that support come from, which is why we're doing things like this with Patron, because again, if we can reach out and get more people involved, and also that sense of engagement and ownership, which people feel if they've somehow contributed. So I'm not sure that quite answers everything, but it is one of those nightmares. And what we do at our museum here, it will be slightly different in different places. Some museums are given a lovely endowment, somebody dies and there's, you know, or they'll give money for purchases. We buy very little here because that amount of money that's actually left over, but we try and swap or we try and get vehicles from other places. We bought our Beaverette, that's the first vehicle we've bought in an awful long time here. So other places like the National Gallery in London, given a large endowment by the Getty Foundation, that's the sort of thing, or J. Paul Getty, that's the sort of thing where that money allows them to go and make a major purchase every now and again. But everyone's in the game and everyone's trying to do it for that sort of support. So in the UK, there is much more, perhaps, central funding for museums than in America. But that's certainly, we look to Europe, where in Europe there's a lot more central funding for museums and less of the charitable side of things. So there's that one. I better move on, otherwise we'll be here all day. Just moving on then to Richard James, did the British experiment with autoloader tanks? Yes, we've got some examples here. Post-war we did, and we've also got 2 autoloaders which were being looked at in the 70s, I think it was, whether we were ever thought of fitting them, but we were trying to weigh up the advantages and disadvantages. So autoloaders, another one of these weird and wonderful areas, certainly in terms of general theory, in Britain, we haven't liked the idea. Pros and cons of autoloaders. Autoloaders really, again, it's reliability, they're getting better. The idea of having to return the gun to a set position all the time, and ultimately it was speed. A well-trained tank crew can still get off more rounds quicker than most, well, pretty much any autoloader system in service at the moment. The other issue about the autoloader, of course, is that the cassette size quite often limited the length of the long rod penetrator, certainly for tank killing purposes, and the longer the long rod penetrator, the better the tank killing round tends to be, and therefore that idea about having to build newer types of cassettes that are much deeper and longer is going to be part of that sort of problem. So I'll see if we can find out a couple of images, but we've got 2 of those test autoloaders here. Right, have I got to the end of all these questions? Right. Chap called Louis Davis asks, what's he got here? He's got about 14 questions. So I'm just going to run to the end one, which is which comes along the line of what got me interested in tanks. I think I'm of a typical generation. We were the model making generation. We had parents or grandparents, certainly for my grandparents, World War I, but the idea of there was boys growing up in the 60s, 70s, we just like models, guns, tanks, aeroplanes, that sort of thing. For me, I was going to go in the army. I did my regimental commissioners board. They said, go away for a year, grow up. I found naked Victorian ladies instead and did history of art. I did all that side of thing before doing that, but I'd always got an interest in the side. So I moved away from it for quite some time. I bought myself a Second World War little Daimler Dingo scout car, which I found fascinating. Job came up at the Tank Museum. That's brought me back here, but the job was as curator, and it kind of fits in with another person's sort of semi-questions, which is, actually, most people come to the museum in a specific job. I was a trained curator, that's looking after things. You hope as a curator you have an enthusiasm for your subject and you hope you have an interest. I'm not an expert. I've just grown into liking the stuff, and my analogy, I think I've said it before, is if I can just about understand what's being said, done, seen what this is for. If I can understand it and explain it to someone else, I think I'm just about there. I'm not that bright, not that stupid, but if I can get it, then hopefully I can explain it to someone else, because I think that's quite an important thing that we as a museum need to do. Collecting is one element of it. It's that interpretation of that collection. How do we get the information? How do we get the enthusiasm we might feel for that collection across to people like yourself? So this is an interest. It's not my only interest, but I know, because sometimes people say, how do you get a job at the Tank Museum? How do you become a tank expert? All those different things. I think, and if we have David Fletcher here, he is no tank expert in the same way as, like, you don't train to be a tank expert. His background, I'll let him explain it all, and how he ended up, by enthusiasm, ending up working at the Tank Museum and coming to write about the subject and being the expert he is to this day. And he is an expert, whereas I just consider myself sort of an enthusiastic amateur. So we have another question. I do follow, sorry, Benjamin Drexler Lemire. I know that some tanks were transported by trains to get them where they need to be more reliably, but what was the best way to get them on and off the trains? So train transport, just so you know, again, right from the time the tank was invented, trains were being used to manoeuvre troops all around the place. The first trains, think of the sponsons on the side, they were first removed to meet the railway gauge, the width that was allowed to be able to manoeuvre big, large items around the country. Later on, the sponsons were pushed inside the vehicle, so again, they can meet that gauge. How they get on and off, in some places, there were set platforms built specially for loading, and we've actually got on the camp here an old concrete ramp, because sometimes it's half hidden by bushes most of the time. That was for the First World War tank crews to practice on how you actually manoeuvred. It's angled at one end. You got level with the railway flat, and then you drove on and drove down the length of the vehicle. Now, there are, in World War I, when they got ready for the Cambrai, they built wooden ramps to get up onto those railway flaps to drive the tanks on and off, and they kind of look very temporary sort of structures. We have in the archive a whole series of different manuals from different periods, which not only tells you the best way, how you're supposed to manoeuvre tanks around by train, but also in an emergency, how you can build angles off the rear of railway flats. And there was a certain type of railway flat as well, where one of the bogies, once it had got to where it needed to be, you could remove that bogie and therefore use the whole of that flat as a ramp, and the other vehicles would drive along the whole length of the flats and then go down the ramp to drive off. So there was lots of different ways. Recently, the British Army, back in 2017, they tried an experiment of taking Challenger tanks through the Channel Tunnel. We used to have specialists. We have still reservists in the British Army who are railway experts who will take charge of such operations. And of course, in World War I, we got one of the best engineers and the railway lines out there in France. World War II, again, that idea about how you were manoeuvring. And the whole point, again, fundamentally behind that is if you can move your vehicle, it's easier, quicker, so much more efficient to move vehicles around on railways rather than driving them on their tracks, which wear out that much quicker, makes damages erode, causes all sorts of issues. So even right up to the front lines, Germans famously, you know, hence the Tiger and its two types of track and everything, where you could, you really tried to use the railways rather than track mileage, as it's called, to wear those things out. But again, I just had a quick look beforehand. There's some lovely illustrations of all these beautiful how you're supposed to build out a railway sleeper, certain types of ramping and what it would be good for and everything. And you can imagine engineers going about doing that, ready to offload tanks as close to the front line as they possibly could. Now, there's another question here I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to come and answer. And Paul Jones says, do you have any current plans for another series similar to the Matilda Diaries? I really enjoyed the coverage, giving real insight into the workshop behind the scenes. So, to tell you all about what we're going to be doing next about covering the workshops, I'm going to ask my colleague Ros to come and have a word with you. Lovely young lady, drinks her own bath water, but put up with her and she'll explain it all.
Thank you for that kind introduction, David. So I know quite a lot of you have been asking what's going to be next after Matilda Diaries, and never fear, there is going to be a Workshop Diaries, which is going to be looking at the ins and outs of all of the projects going on in the workshop. We're just working on that now. We hope to have an episode out in a few weeks' time, and we hope you'll all enjoy the new series. Thank you very much for listening to the whole of David's Q&A, and thank you as always for supporting us on Patreon.